Revolution, annexation, rebellion. It's all been happening in Ukraine, an Eastern European country that was part of the Soviet Union until 1991. Ukraine sits between the European Union and Russia, literally and figuratively. So what's the deal? Here's a cheat sheet on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. First, let's rewind to November 2013. That's when Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych rejected a trade deal with the European Union, taking a bailout from Russia instead. Thousands of people, young and old, began protesting the move at Kiev's Maidan Square because they saw an EU deal as key to the country's economic future. But the government cracked down hard, leading to the deaths of at least 70 Ukrainians by February 2014. Ukraine's politicians eventually removed Yanukovych from power and paved the way for a new presidential election, which is how Petro Poroshenko, who supported the protests, was voted president in May. And that's where the story might have ended if it weren't for two things. One, Ukraine is divided between an eastern region with close historic and cultural ties to Russia, and the rest of the country which identifies as more Ukrainian than anything else. And two, Russia does not want to lose its influence in Ukraine. Which brings us to Crimea, a battleground in the Ukraine-Russia conflict that happens to sit on an oil and gas bonanza. Most Crimeans speak Russian as their native language, as do many people in eastern Ukraine. And when the pro-EU protests were winding down in Kiev, pro-Russia protesters began making their voices heard in Crimea. Russian soldiers in unmarked uniforms then took over buildings and airports in the region. Russia would eventually send hundreds of troops into Crimea, which Ukraine called an invasion. But Crimean politicians put separation from Ukraine up for a vote. More than 90% of Crimeans voted to ditch Ukraine and join Russia, at least according to officials there. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Crimea was now part of Russia. But the international community wasn't having it. NATO condemned what it called the so-called referendum held at gunpoint. And the EU and US slapped Russia with what would be just the first round of sanctions. So what could possibly make the situation between Russia and Ukraine any more complicated? A rebellion fueled by pro-Russian separatists in other parts of eastern Ukraine. Rebels took control of government buildings in several eastern cities in April. And while they started out as a ragtag group, Russian nationals with fighting experience crossed the border to lead them, according to the United Nations. Meanwhile, Ukraine's own forces fought back for control. At least 1,000 people died between mid-April and mid-July because of the conflict, many of them civilians. And 298 people died when Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was apparently mistakenly shot down by rebels, triggering more EU sanctions on Russia. Russia, for its part, repeatedly denied sending troops and weapons over the border, despite Ukraine's claims, NATO photos, and even video footage to the contrary. That's your cheat sheet on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Where do you think it all goes from here? Let us know. Subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook.